It's my pleasure to be here, and I want to change gears for us just a little bit. And I want to tell you three stories that I think relate to this moment we find ourselves in as we are problematizing what it means to think about democracy and the roles of technology therein. And I want to go back to the 1940s, and I want to reflect on a moment in time in late 1948 when the world seemed like it was moving incredibly quickly, when every newspaper was full of details of the latest thing computers could do, and every month they seemed to be able to do more than they could do the minute before, where the cataclysmic impact of World War II was physically written on half of the countries in Europe, physically written on the bodies and families of millions of people the world over, where the role of technology in that war and in the peace felt not out of control, but certainly escalatory. And in that moment in time, there were lots of people writing lots of thought pieces about the future of computing, about the future of the role of computing in society, about what it would mean to have computational objects that could store all of our thinking, about what it would mean to outsource our memories to computational objects, about what it would mean about truth and democracy and citizenship and personhood, and about whether we had any agency to make choices about what came next. And in that moment of all of that febrile activity, a collection of really unexpected people gathered in New York City in a hotel to argue about what the future was going to be. And that group of people brought together Norbert Wiener and John von Neumann, so men who'd been involved in building the ENIAC and early computing. It brought Gregory Bateson and Margaret Mead, two world kind of renowned anthropologists who were really interested in thinking about the relationship between culture and change. It brought Licklider, the man who would give us the internet. It had Claude Shannon, the sort of head of information architecture and basically this first CTO a company had at Bell Labs, and a whole collection of other people. And they argued about the future, and they argued about what terms we should have for the future. And they wondered collectively and iteratively through a whole series of conversations about what was the vocabulary we needed, what was the mental model we needed to have, and how would we think about managing all that computing so that it didn't end up in driving yet another escalation of war, violence, and destruction. And the thing they came to was an idea that they called cybernetics. That's an old word. You'll recognize it. It's been living rent-free in your head because of science fiction for the last 50 years. If you were my age and maybe Lee's age, and I'm not sure about Attila's, but I'm going to suggest it might be his age too, you will recognize cybernetics from Douglas Adams' Serious Cybernetics Company, possibly from the Terminator and a few other places. But back in the 1940s, it was a way to describe the system, and it was a way to describe complex dynamic systems that had computing at their core. And it was a theory of systems that privileged both the components and the relationships between them. And it argued really powerfully for the fact that you had to have humans, technology, and the environment in a constant loop, and that you needed to think about all of those pieces. Now, cybernetics was one way to think about the world. Turned out it was a really powerful one. It endured in really unexpected ways. As Lee and I both know, the men who gathered in Dartmouth in 1956 to coin the phrase artificial intelligence and to assert the proposition that you could so precisely describe learning in the human intellect that a machine could be made to simulate it, all of those guys were part of the cybernetics conversations. They created the phrase artificial intelligence because they didn't want Norbert Wiener to come to the event because he was kind of unpleasant. So they figured if they gave it a different name, he wouldn't attend. So we end up with artificial intelligence as a formulation of technology, in part to exclude someone and in part to streamline a conversation about what technology could do. Because what we get to when we get to artificial intelligence is a removal of the notion of where humans might sit, where the environment might sit, and about the relationships between and through all of those things. So that's story number one. Story number two is if you sit here in 2023 and you think to yourself, are we in a moment where it feels like the role of technology is being relitigated, where we worry about the relationships between ourselves, computational machines, and the roles they might have in our lives? And as everyone who has come before me on this day keeps asserting, it's all about a system, whether that system is democracy, the economy, the environment, computation itself. It's really pretty clear that this idea of the system is this really important way of thinking about things and a really important tool we need to get a handle on and a vocabulary for. So when I came home to Australia back in 2017, I came home with the demented ambition that what I wanted to do was establish a new branch of engineering, specifically to manage that AI system and to think about how we could take it safely, responsibly, and sustainably to scale. And I've come to realize over the last 7 years that what I'm really doing is building capability and capacity. And it's capability and capacity around how we think about systems. How do we find a vocabulary? How do we find the necessary tools to equip ourselves, our students, our colleagues, our citizens to be able to see the world not just as individuals, but as systems? And what does it mean to be able to think about what are the components of that system? How do those components relate to and with each other so that it's never just a laundry list, but it's actually about the dynamics and the relationships? And in building that capability, what we're also building is a set of key conversations and I hope key decision makers who help unfold a different set of futures, one that's more sensitive to the fact that all of these things are indeed systems and that changing these systems isn't just about regulating one piece of the equation, but actually taking a whole point of view. And I guess that leaves me in this rapid rush through history from cybernetics in 1946, 47, 48, artificial intelligence in 1956, School of Cybernetics here in Australia in 2021, about what the through line is. And the through line's about how is it that we as individuals, as citizens of democratic nations, in this particular instance for me, Australia, how is it that we show up in these conversations? And how is it that we show up equipped to think about what the 21st century demands of us? It demands how we think about technology, but it's never just about the technology. It's who is using the technology, who's implicated by the technology, who isn't involved in the conversations about the technology, what is the world that technology imagines that it is building and who is in and who is out. It's about what is the environmental footprint of those technologies, how do we think about and develop a point of view about those things. It's about where they're built, the supply chains that they're implicated in, and where we sit in all of those incredibly complicated pieces of the puzzle. And so for me, at least, when I sit on my lucky days in my office here at the Australian National University, and I think about what is the role of universities in a democratic society and in a democratic conversation, I tend to think it's about two things. Respectfully, because I know my boss was on here earlier this morning and today, and I know he was feeling a little bit anxious about the world. I actually think one of our roles is to tell stories about the future that are hopeful stories, stories that let us find our agency, stories that are about a future that is more fair, more sustainable, and more just. But I'm also a realist, and I know it's not just enough to tell those stories. We also have to actively work in the present to disrupt the world we find ourselves in order to make those futures possible. And for me, that disruption is about how we build capability and how we teach ourselves to see the systems so that we can build better, regulate better, transform better, resist better when necessary, decommission when required, and ultimately have a capacity to think about democracy as one of those systems too, not just something that is at the vicissitudes of technologies, but a system in which we actually want to be profoundly and constantly invested.